Good day, Philippines. My name is Beblanche Lapinid, a student from University of Cebu Main Campus. Now, in today's video presentation, we'll be having the report of the cholera epidemic in the Philippines during 1902. Now, let's differentiate the pandemic between epidemics. So, when we say pandemic, it is the widespread of bacteria or viruses that happening in the continents. Means all people living in the earth or in the continents are affected by the specific virus or bacteria. So one of the examples of pandemic is the coronavirus, in which we are struggling in these recent times. Now when we say epidemic, these are the widespread of bacteria or viruses that are widespread within the country. So one of the examples of epidemic is the cholera of the Philippines. Now by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to recognize the experience of the Filipinos during those times, create strategies and develop resilience from pandemics, and then you visualize the presentation of the early Filipinos for the survival of the epidemics.
Cholera is an acute diarrheal illness caused by infection of the intestine with Vibrio cholerae bacteria. People can get sick when they swallow food or water contaminated with cholera bacteria. The 1899 to 1902 War of Resistance and the 1902 to 1904 cholera epidemic belong to two distinct eras in the Philippine historiography. Cholera was introduced into the Marikina Valley east of Manila by troops sent to guard against infection of the Manila water supply. Victims of cholera were American soldiers and residents, prominent Filipinos, Chinese, and Spaniards. In March 1902 was the fourth year of the Philippine-American War. Many towns in Luzon homelanded by the Americans suffered from famine. In Isabela, Emilio Aguinaldo would soon be captured. In Batangas, Miguel Malvar felt forced to surrender so that the rice could be planted in May. To top it all, cholera arrived for the inhabitants of the war-torn areas. It was ultimately a choice between dying of hunger or dying of cholera, wrote historian Ronaldo C. Alito. A vessel from Hong Kong arrives in Manila carrying cholera. Soon after, the first cases of cholera surfaced. Cholera was impossible to contain because the Filipinos and even the American troops themselves moved around carrying the bacteria. The hardest hit of cholera was in Manila because of the overcrowding, poor sanitation, and poor diet. By the time the epidemic ended, about 109,461 died and 4,386 of which were in Manila. The cholera epidemic gave way to what Alito calls germ warfare, another stage of the Philippine-American War. During this time, military surgeons became the next wave of pacifiers after the cavalrymen and troops. Searches and surveillance were conducted among Filipino homes to ferret out the sick and quarantine them. The Filipino response was concealment and evasion, since they refused to part with their sick family members. Within the cholera combat zone, colonial officials prohibited gatherings of people in places considered conducive to the spread of cholera, like churches and cockpits. Officials also resorted to burning the houses of cholera victims and even gathering places like the town market. By cremating cholera casualties, they elicited further resistance and hatred among Filipinos whose religious practices demanded proper burial.
Now, by the end of this presentation, I will be able to give some examples of the environment that are usually used by the Filipino people and easily contaminated by the cholera bacteria. The example that was contaminated with the cholera bacteria is what we call in the Filipino term is papa. Filipino in that time, they often put or throw their waste there. However, it could be if that person has a cholera bacteria, you could also be contaminated or affected by the cholera bacteria. However, the possible happening it will spread in your whole community.
Water well was not safety during cholera epidemic. It's because it wasn't distilled and has a possible of cholera contamination.